Global population is declining. Birth rates fell by more than 4% last year from 2022, and that could be a problem for the global economy. We want to bring in James Pomeroy. He is HSBC's global economist. James, it's great to see you there. Your note caught our attention a few weeks back when you wrote it here. The note was titled "The Baby Bust Intensifies." Talk to us just about the economic consequences you see from declining birth rates across the world.
Yeah, it's a fascinating subject, and it's one I think a lot of investors and a lot of economists need to take quite a lot more seriously, because you say it's one of these subjects that's so important, yet it's sort of hidden away from the front pages. And it's absolutely crucial because it's going to determine so many things within the global economy. It's going to impact the size of populations over the course of the next few decades and what that means for aggregate size of GDP, who the world's largest economies are. It's going to matter for growth rates in terms of the share of the population that's working age, in terms of whether we've got enough workers, how we've got enough people to pay for our pensioners, all of these various challenges that are very, very important because of demographics. And when we're seeing birth rates decline as quickly as they are, we start to get quite worried that the world's population could start peaking out more quickly than a lot of people expect. That means lower potential growth in the global economy, particularly in those countries where birth rates are declining particularly quickly.
So, James, take the U.S., for example. When we talk about the declining birth rates and what we have seen, many of the millennials not having kids until later in life, and then when they do have kids, not having nearly as many as the prior generation. Talk to me a little bit more about what exactly then that translates into that GDP hit. How big of a hit could we see as a result of this, and what does that timeline look like?
Yeah, it impacts GDP in a number of different ways. But if we think about it through the very basics of the size of the population, if you're having people having 2 or 3% fewer children a year, which is basically the path we're on at the moment in many developed economies, including the US, then further down the line, you're talking about a population that's considerably different in size than your sort of base case you might be thinking about in sort of underlying projections. And that difference between those scenarios can be up to an implication of sort of 0.2, 0.3 percentage points per year in terms of the population growth difference by the time you take this out 10, 15, 20 years. So you're talking about, just from the size of the population, potential hits to potential GDP growth that can be up to that range. And then on top of that, there's the additional challenge of the tilt in the shape of the population. So you have fewer young people, more sort of people retiring, and that creates also a challenge for the economy that can mean lower per capita growth as well, because you end up sort of skewing investment in the wrong places, and you don't have as many workers, and all those other potential challenges we know you can get from sort of misshapen population pyramids. So you're probably talking 0.3, 0.4 percentage points per year in terms of GDP growth difference between a good birth rate scenario and a bad birth rate scenario. And essentially, we're looking like we're going down the bad birth rate scenario at the moment, which means much lower potential growth, not just a 2024 story, but over the next couple of decades.
Hey, James, it's so interesting because some people would look at this and say, hey, maybe it is good news. It's going to take some of that strain, like you pointed out in your note, off of the global when we take into account what we have seen play out just in terms of some questions or some concerns about the environment, and then pairing that too with the public infrastructure. So they're viewing that as almost a good thing. But talk to me, though, more specifically about what it could force governments to do on a taxing basis when we're talking about spending plans, and how that also fits in to that impact you're talking about when it comes to GDP.
But that's it. People like to look at this stuff and they go, isn't this fantastic? We've got this huge climate problem, and fewer people means less demand for natural resources. That's clearly quite good news. We talk a lot about housing shortages. That's a key reason, ironically, why people are having fewer children. But you sort of get a shrinking population. You start to sort of take away some of those challenges. So housing shortage, less of a problem. Public transport, less of a problem. Congestion, less of a problem. That sounds fantastic. But it comes at a cost. And it comes at a cost of having fewer workers, fewer consumers, and governments who are still stuck with a very, very large bill to pay because of the debt levels that have been built up in recent years, particularly during the pandemic. And so, to be honest, when you look at the demographic pyramids across the West, they're extremely concerning, and something substantial has to be done. But policymakers don't want to make those changes because they're unbelievably unpopular. And you've essentially got a suite of options, and you can start with, you can raise the retirement age. And I'm sorry to everyone watching this, but it's going to have to happen. How high, I don't know. It's going to depend on different countries and when you do it, but it's got to go much, much higher. We're going to have to think seriously about how we're funding things that are used disproportionately by older populations. So That's thinking seriously about pension programs, thinking about healthcare services in economies where there is universal healthcare. We have to seriously question whether that's a sort of plausible model in a situation where a much greater share of the population is older. And on top of that, you've got the other challenge of, do you just raise taxes loads to pay for all of this? Now, no one's going to vote for any of these things, and that's an enormous challenge for many of these economies. When you're talking about 30% of the population being over the age of 65, there's a bill there that's got to be paid. So if you're unwilling to accept those things, you either have to accept being poorer, or we're going to have to think really seriously about migration into a lot of developed economies to try and make up that shortfall of potential workers. But that creates other challenges. Migration is not so straightforward. You have to think about integrating people into the economy, into society, making sure people have got the right skills. And that's another challenge that we're creating. But one of these things, or multiple of these things, is going to have to be done in the coming years. It's just at the moment, none of those things are overly popular.
James, the adoption of AI, is that going to be able to offset some of these concerns? We talk about how AI is going to help with productivity. It's going to help people achieve what they're doing today in a much more timely manner. Is that going to offset some of this concern to some extent?
Oh, definitely. I think it does. I think if you think about not just AI, but broad automation could be a real force for good for the global economy for many reasons, but particularly in a situation where you've got this shrinking working age population and we almost need to create fewer jobs. And actually that risk of AI and automation taking jobs isn't really there because of these demographic changes. But AI doesn't necessarily solve that fiscal problem. And it doesn't solve that challenge of who's going to foot the bill for an aging population. And so we might have to think a little bit more carefully about where that tax revenue comes from, and some of those other challenges are still going to be there. But no, don't get me wrong, AI will act as quite a good counterbalance on that growth front, particularly on the labor market side of things for these rapidly aging populations across the world.
James Pomeroy, great stuff. Thank you so much for breaking down this note. It caught our attention. We were looking forward to speaking with you. So thanks for taking the time, HSBC's Global Economist.